Hmm. Um, Hello, everybody. Welcome to this second webinar in this series of 3 on the green status of species. I'm Molly Böhm, Freshwater Conservation Coordinator here at the Global Center for Species Survival at the Indianapolis Zoo, which is a partnership between the Indy Zoo and the IUCN Species Survival Commission. It's great to see so many of you here for this second session, and I know there's still a few more people coming in. Great to have you all here. This session really is going to introduce some of the actual mechanisms that facilitate green status of species assessments. And so it's my great pleasure today to introduce Molly.grace again from the IUCN SSC Green Status of Species Task Force. And also her colleague Magda Cygan from the IUCN Red List Unit. Sorry, my voice also today really struggling. So I do apologize. Before I hand over, just a few housekeeping notes. Feel free again to introduce yourself in the chat. It's always great to see where everybody is going to join us from. And then when it comes to any questions that you have for Molly and also for Magda, please share your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And at the end of Molly's presentation, my colleague Andrea, Magda as well, and I will read questions, post questions to Magda and Molly. And we hope to get as many of them as addressed as is possible in this hour that we've got. So without much further ado, I hand over to Molly to please share her screen and get us started.
Thank you very much, Moni. Let's get this screen up. All right, hopefully everyone can see that. Let me just hide this participant bar. There we go. Perfect. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming to this webinar. Depending on where you are in the world, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's lovely to be here with you all. I was looking at the participants list and I see some names that I recognize, some new names. So some people on this call might be familiar with the green status, might have worked with me and Magda in the past. But I'm really excited today to tell you about some new mechanisms, some updates that we have to help you understand and conduct green status of species assessments. So without further ado, let's get started. So in this session, we're going to be covering the following topics. So how do you find information that you need to complete green status of species assessments? I'll be introducing the online training course, which is just launched in its full form. I'll discuss potential mechanisms of funding and support for assessments, and then we should have time for some Q&A. So first of all, what is the green status of species? Just a little bit of background. This was covered in our first webinar, but just to make sure everyone's on the same page. The green status of species is an expansion of the Red List of Threatened Species, and it is an assessment that, just like the Red List, is applicable to all fungi, plants, and animals. And if you go on the Red List website, you'll see more and more species being updated with this new green button that accompanies its Red List category. So the green status provides new metrics of species recovery to complement our familiar Red List categories of extinction risk, and I'll go through these in more detail. But you can think about the green status of species as expanding the language of conservation that we use to talk about the conservation status of species. So going beyond extinction risk and introducing standardized ways to report on species level of recovery. So the green status of species assessment has 2 primary aims. The first aim is to provide a standardized framework for measuring species recovery, as I said, and there's also a secondary aim of assessing the impact of and incentivizing conservation action. So just a really quick recap of those 2 aims. So our first aim, measuring species recovery. This is really important because while the Red List does a fantastic job of telling us about the extinction risk of a species, it doesn't tell us the entire story. And a really good example of this is a least concerned species that has been stable for many years, and perhaps the population is increasing. So definitely it's not at risk of going extinct anytime soon. But that same species could have experienced really steep historic declines in abundance or range or any of those measures. And so while the species definitely isn't at risk of going extinct, we probably can't say that it's recovered. So the green status was developed in part to address issues like that. So in our green status of species framework, we provide a definition of a fully recovered species. And this definition is really just a benchmark that we can use to compare recovery status between species in a standardized way. And so this definition of a fully recovered species is a species that is viable and ecologically functional in each part of its indigenous range. We went through some of the technical details of that in the last webinar, but if you're unsure about any of those terms, feel free to ask me questions afterward or pop them in the chat and Magda can answer those questions for you. And so if a species met this definition of a fully recovered species, it would get what's called a green score, so a measurement of recovery of 100% up here. Of course, unfortunately, most species are not meeting that definition. They are not viable and functional throughout their historic range. And so that score can vary from 0 to 100%. So you have 100% of fully recovered species at the top. And then as you move away from that fully recovered definition, you go through categories. So slightly depleted species, moderately depleted species, largely depleted species, critically depleted species. And then finally at 0%, you have a species that's extinct or extinct in the wild. And you can see those categories visualized here right next to our red list category. And so the idea is that now we have two different axes, if you will, two different types of categories to think about the recovery status of a species. One for extinction risk and one for level of depletion relative to that fully recovered definition. And then the second aim of the green status of species assessment is to assess the impact of and incentivize conservation action. How does the green status do that? Well, we can measure our green score at the current time. So what is the observed recovery status of the species? But in the assessment, you can also assess what that score would be under various different scenarios. So if you assess the score that is expected to be what the status of the species is today, if no conservation action had taken place in the past, the difference between that hypothetical score and the one you actually observe gives you a metric called conservation legacy. So a formal way to show the impact of past conservation on species recovery, which is really fantastic. We also have a scenario looking 10 years into the future. If no conservation action continued. So if all conservation actions stop today, how do we expect that recovery score to change? And the difference between the current score that we observe and that hypothetical future score gives us a metric called conservation dependence, which allows us to make a case for continued conservation of that species. Oops. We also have a scenario called conservation gain, where we're looking 10 years into the future. If conservation continues as planned, how do we expect that score to change in the short term? And then finally, we have a metric called recovery potential, which looks at the maximum possible increase in that score over the next 100 years with all possible conservation action. And an example of this is one of the species that's been published on the Red List website. So this oak species, it's an endangered species and it's considered largely depleted. So it's not in the lowest green status category, but it's not very high either. And we also see here its conservation impact metrics. So you'll notice that it has a 0 conservation legacy, and that's not because no conservation has been done for the species. It's just because this is a slow growing species, and so any change and impact takes a while to accumulate. But you can see in some of the other conservation impact metrics that the conservation gain of this species is medium. So actually those past conservation actions are going to bear fruit within the next 10 years, and that's measured in this assessment. And the species also has a high recovery potential, meaning that relative to its current distribution, we can restore more viable and functional populations throughout its historic range. So this is the sort of information and storytelling that the green status assessment can help you give for your species. So with that brief introduction out of the way, let's get to the heart of this webinar, which is, that all sounds nice, Molly, but how do I actually do these assessments? It is potentially a complex assessment. How do you find the information that you need to complete the assessment? So I'm going to start by talking through some online resources, and I will note that there's going to be lots of resources shared today. I'll be putting links up and QR codes. If you don't quite catch a URL or a QR code, this webinar will be made available online through the Global Center for Species Survival. Thank you very much. So you will be able to go back and find those links later if you don't catch them today. So the easiest place to start, if you are very new to green status of species assessments and the assessment process, is the Red List website. So there is a brief overview available on the website. So if you go to IUCNredlist.org and you go to the About part of that website, there is an IUCN green status page. And this is just a few pages of introductory material, the background, the history, the rationale. So a very sort of broad level introduction to the assessment process. So if you really are starting from ground zero, if you know nothing about this, this is a really good place to start. And then on the Red List website also, there is more detailed information. So you've read through the background information and you want to potentially undertake an assessment yourself. On that website, under the resources page, there are green status assessment materials. So if you go navigate to that website, the link is on the bottom of the screen here, you'll see a number of resources that are available to you. So the first is the Green Status of Species Standard. So this is the official IUCN document that lays out many of the definitions of terms and the basic structure and purpose of the assessment. That is linked on this Guidelines and Assessment Materials page, and it is available in English, French, and Spanish. If anyone would like to translate it into other languages, please get in touch with me. I'd be very interested in making this more accessible to other scientists around the world. Then also on this Guidelines and Materials page, we have instructions for conducting a green status of species assessment. So this is unlike the standard, which is what I just showed you, which is very technical and definition focused. The instructions take you through step by step and sort of walk you through the process. It's about a 19-page document. It's not super long, but it gives you a bit more information about how do you go through each step in the assessment process. So the image that's being shown on screen there is the section in the instructions about how do you determine the range of the species. And it gives some examples throughout that document as well. And then we have, if you really want to get nerdy and you want to get into the technical details, we have the background and guidelines document, which again is available in English, French, and Spanish. That previous instructions document I just showed is also available in French and Spanish. And so this is quite a long document, but it goes through and talks through each of the steps of the assessment, provides lots of technical detail. If you have any questions about what a term means or the precise method to use, this is the document that you will want to use. So those three documents are on this Guidelines and Assessment Materials page, and they're very, very useful for getting your head around what is this assessment, how do I do it? On that same page, a little bit lower down, we actually have assessment materials. You can find that here. We have those available in English, French, and Spanish. Essentially, you can download an Excel workbook that allows you to input data. It has instructions in the workbook, and it automatically calculates all of the assessment results for you. So this is just a screenshot of one part of that assessment workbook. And, there are cells where you enter information. There are questions to guide you through what information do you need to enter in each place. And so all of the required supporting information and the actual assessment data itself is very clearly marked. So if you want to have a stab, have a try at doing an assessment, I recommend you download this workbook. and see if you can follow along and get the assessment output. I will mention that these resources are about to become a little bit out of date because we are almost ready to launch the Green Status module in SIS. So when that's ready, you'll be able to enter data directly in SIS and not have to use this workbook. But I think these online workbooks are really useful if you don't have access to SIS or you want to just do a practice. You can use this material to go through the assessment, work out any issues, and then enter the data in SIS. And so next week, actually, our final webinar of this series is going to be introducing all of you to the SIS module for the green status. So I've just gone through the resources available on the Red List website, and these resources are a really excellent first reference point if you want to get into the assessment, figure out, just get an idea of how it all works. So when you are actually going through the assessment, you've read through all that background information, you might still have some questions about where to find information for the assessment. So I'm going to go through a little bit of that just now. So resources relating to our first aim of the green status, so providing a standardized framework for measuring species recovery. So again, we have our fully recovered definition. So a fully recovered species is viable and ecologically functional in each part of its indigenous range. And if you were to do the assessment, you'd have to go through a number of steps to see whether or not that definition is met. So the first step would be to define the indigenous range of the species. The indigenous range of the species is the current range where the species is extant, plus the range prior to major human impacts. And all of this is defined in those guidance documents that I mentioned in much more detail than I can get into here. But you might wonder, how do I determine where a species was found prior to major impacts? How would I generate a map that looks something like this example we have on the screen? Where do I get that information? So I will say that as you're going through the assessment, the online resources will really be a great guide in helping you find sources of information. So for example, in the assessment workbook, on the page where we're asking you to determine the range, we reference specific sections of the guidelines that you should refer to as a resource. We also link to resources that might be helpful to you to do that. And so I'm going to go through some of those now. So many of you will be familiar with the Red List assessment process. In some cases, the extinct range is mapped on the Red List as part of the Red List assessment, not for all species, but for some. So when you're doing a green status assessment, it's always a really good idea to start by reading through the Red List account, seeing what information you can glean from that account. And in some cases, you might also have this documentation of past range of the species there already. But you might have to do a little bit more digging if you want to figure out the indigenous range of a species. And luckily, there's actually a wealth of biodiversity data in the historical ecology literature and other collections that scientists have made throughout the centuries. So historical ecology papers are an excellent resource. So when we were looking at the status of the gray whale, for example, we found lots of great papers looking at whale records from the 16th and 17th centuries, places where whales used to be recorded, but they're no longer recorded today. So historical ecology papers are a really fantastic resource. And there's probably more out there than you think. So it might not be an insurmountable task to find this information. Museum specimens are also a really fantastic resource, whether those are specimens in herbaria or museum collections of vertebrates. Definitely, you might have to get a bit creative and go beyond the normal resources that you use when you're thinking about studying the species that you focus on. But there's a lot of information out there. For some species, even with those historical records, there's not a really great, record, for lack of a better word, of species that are cryptic or rare, or just haven't really been paid attention to historically. But never fear, because there are other resources that you can use. So one example that I'm highlighting here is potential natural vegetation, which shows the modeled land cover in the absence of human modification of the landscape. Apologies for the misspelling of modification there. But if you have a species that depends on a particular habitat type, for example, you could look at something like this to infer what the range of the species would have been prior to major human activities that have modified habitat or changed it completely to an area that's not accessible for the species. Okay, so in the assessment process, the first step is to define the indigenous range, and then the next step is to define spatial units. And so this range is divided into spatial units because we want to be able to assess variation in species status across the range. So in our guidelines, the document that I showed earlier, we recommend different ways of dividing the range into spatial units. There are more preferred and least preferred ways of doing this. So usually divisions based on biology or ecology are preferable for this assessment, but you can also use less biologically based divisions like anthropogenic borders or locations or grid cells. So all of this information is talked about in the guidelines. And again, in our guidance in the assessment workbook, we refer to specific sections of the guidelines that you can refer to as you are conducting this assessment and justifying why you've chosen the spatial units that you did. And then step 3 is to assess the state in each spatial unit. And this is the one that I think people find potentially a bit scary, because if you remember from Magda's talk, there are 4 possible states you could assign to a spatial unit: absent, present, viable, and functional, going from worst to best. And these are, in many cases, based on the red list category that you would assign to the spatial unit using a regional assessment, regional red list assessment. And this, sounds like it could potentially be a lot of work, right? If I have to do a red list assessment for every single one of these spatial units. But we have developed tools to help you with this. And another tool that I hadn't pointed out before, but I'll point out now on that guidelines and assessment materials page on the Red List website, is a green status of species state calculator. This is linked in the assessment workbook as well, but it's a really straightforward way to help you make that red list category determination for a spatial unit. Basically, the way it works is it takes you through a series of binary questions where you don't need to know exact numbers. You just have to know if a value is more or less than a certain number. So for example, the very first question is the population size 0 or more than 0? And then as you answer those questions, it automatically guides you through the red list process. It skips over parts that are irrelevant based on questions you've already answered. Another example is it asks you about the area of occupancy, the AOO of the species within the spatial unit. You don't need to know exactly what it is. You just need to know if it's more or less than 2,000 kilometers squared. So these sort of questions are, in most cases, pretty straightforward to answer. There is a way to incorporate uncertainty into this, which we'll cover in the next webinar. But this is a really good resource to get you started. And once you've answered the questions, the calculator tells you what the status of the spatial unit should be based on the information that you've entered. So it really expedites, it really speeds up that process of determining what should the state in all of my different spatial units be. So hopefully that will be helpful to people who were intimidated by the idea of having to do a red list assessment for every single one of those spatial units. And then finally, the last step is to take the state in each spatial unit that you've determined and combine them to give the species recovery score. So that 0 to 100% score that represents how far or close a species is to full recovery. So again, 0% represents a species where all the spatial units are absent, so it's extinct or extinct in the wild. 100% represents a species where all spatial units are functional, so it's a fully recovered species. in the example that we have on the screen here, where we have mostly absent spatial units and one viable one, that shakes out to a score of 10%. So this percent value is based on a calculation, which I'm not going to show because that calculation is automatically done for you. So if you want to look at the guidance documents as to what that calculation actually is, you're very welcome to, but you don't have to do any maths yourself. That calculation is done for you. So I've shown a little bit of a video here. And if you look at this square where there's about to be some information and you look at the output score, you'll notice that when you enter information, the score changes. So hopefully this video will work. Just to show it again, in case you missed it, blink and you will miss it. As you enter information, that score changes. And that's how it works as you're doing the assessment, whether it's in this workbook or when we do it in SIS. All you have to do is enter the states and all of the maths are done for you. So it's very straightforward. It's very user-friendly in that way. Oops. In addition to those scores being calculated for you with uncertainty, which again, we'll talk about in our next webinar, the categories are also automatically calculated for you. So you don't need to consult any tables, anything like that. Whether you're using the Excel workbook or SIS, the scores and the categories are all calculated for you. And if you want to learn more about that, please come to our webinar next week where we'll be focusing on SIS and uncertainty. And then what about the other part of the assessment? What information might you need to assess the impact of conservation action with the hope of incentivizing future conservation action? So just as a recap, this part of the assessment involves estimating these 4 new conservation impact metrics. So again, conservation legacy, the impact of past conservation dependence, the dependence of the species on continued conservation in the short term, conservation gain, the expected benefit of planned and ongoing conservation in the short term, and then finally recovery potential, so the maximum possible recovery for the species within the next 100 years. So the first thing to know about these conservation impact metrics is that they are optional. You can publish an assessment with just the species recovery score and category. That's absolutely fine. That is the minimum required information for the assessment. However, many assessors really find it valuable to calculate at least some of the conservation impact metrics to tell a more complete story of the species recovery and the impact that conservation has had and can potentially have on that recovery in the future. So you can do as many of the conservation impact metrics as you like. You can pick and choose. You don't have to do all 4. And to calculate those, you follow the exact same method as you did for the species recovery score. So the current observed recovery score of the species by assessing the state in each spatial unit, but you're assessing what you expect the state would be under these various scenarios with and without conservation. So you can use the online state calculator for these scenarios, but you just have to change the data you input based on what you expect those values would be under scenarios with and without conservation. And of course, we have provided some guidance on how do you estimate these scenarios. So if you go to our background and guidelines document on the Red List website on that guidelines and assessment materials page, we have an entire appendix that has a very detailed guidance on how do you build scenarios to estimate conservation impact metrics. It takes you through all of the steps, all of the things you should consider, what sort of evidence you can use, what to do if you don't have a particular type of evidence, how to incorporate uncertainty. So that guidance is all there for you in the background and guidelines document. And just like with our species recovery score and category, the 4 conservation impact metrics and their categories are all automatically calculated for you. And again, this will be done in SIS too, and we'll talk about that in our webinar next week. Okay, so those are some of the resources that have been around for a while to help you with green status of species assessments. Hopefully there was some good information there, even for people who have been somewhat familiar with the assessment. But now I'm going to talk about something that is newer and really exciting, which is our online training course. So the online training course, it's available at this link. You can also scan the QR code in the upper corner to get to that web page. And it's really exciting because just last week, the training course was released in English. It will be made available in other languages over the summer. But just to give you an idea of what is included in that training course, these are the different modules available on the website. So there are 10 modules in total. Each module takes between 20 minutes and 40 minutes to complete. And in each module, you have sort of read through lessons with lots of examples, lots of real world information. And then in each lesson, you also have checks for understanding. So you can test your knowledge as you go along. And if you don't get enough right, it actually makes you take it again until you get it right. So you're definitely going to learn the basics of the green status using this method. There's also a final exam at the end, so you can test your knowledge and get a certificate that you have passed, you are certified, you've passed the green status of species online training course. So if you want to enroll in this course, which I highly recommend you do if you're interested, again, you can use this link or scan that QR code. And the only thing to know is that you need to enroll as a conservation partner, not the Nature Conservancy staff. So this online training course is hosted very generously by the Nature Conservancy on their training website. But unless you are TNC staff, you want to enroll as a conservation partner. So you can log in on this side, sign up for an account, not the Nature Conservancy staff. And as I mentioned, just last week, we've finalized everything in English, so the full course is available. If you complete that course, you'll know everything you need to know to do a green status of species assessment. We are just finalizing the Spanish and French translations, and those will be launched this summer. If you want to sign up for the training course, enroll in the training course, you can sign up for updates, so you'll receive an email when the Spanish and French are available. Okay, and the last thing I want to talk about is funding and support. So this is the question we always get, even if, you really wanted to do a green status of species assessment, there's only so many hours in the day. And if you can't get funding for assessments, it can potentially be a bit of a challenge to get them done. So thinking of funding, the first thing that I want to flag is opportunities within the SSC, the Species Survival Commission, which I think many people on this call are members of or part of specialist groups that are members of the SSC. And within the IUCN Species Strategic Plan for this quadrennium, so now through 2025, the SSC has set a goal of completing 5,000 green status of species assessments within that period. And so some of you may be familiar with SSC internal grants, follow-up funding to SSC internal grants, and SSC internship grants. So this is completing green status assessments is an established goal of the SSC. So we've had some good success in getting funding through SSC funding to conduct green status of species assessments. And our team, so I'll put contact information for myself and other members of my team up later, but we're very happy to help you write those grants to show examples of past funding applications that have been successful. So a great example of this is the Orchid Specialist Group, which successfully won an SSC internal grant to assess the green status and the red list category of a number of Dracula orchids. And then the Amphibian Specialist Group also got an SSC internal grant to conduct green status assessments for amphibians in the Cerrado and Pantanal region. So just two examples of successful funding applications, specifically to carry out green status assessments, among other activities. Outside of the SSC or even outside of IUCN, there are external grants available. So just to give a few examples of some of those success stories, the IUCN Primate Specialist Group has received funding from the US Fish and Wildlife Service to assess the green status of great apes in Africa. Foundation Franklinia has been an amazing supporter of the green status. So members of these 4 specialist groups, so Global Trees, Conifer Specialist Group, cycad Specialist Group, and Mangrove Specialist Group, all participated in a green status assessment workshop funded by Franklinia. And currently, the Freshwater Conservation Committee has received funding through Synchronicity Earth to do assessments of a number of freshwater species across taxa, invertebrates, plants, vertebrates. So definitely there is interest. The green status is a new and exciting tool to measure species recovery and conservation impact. So there has been a lot of interest from external organizations in funding assessments and, being able to use those results in their own work. And as I said, if you would like to apply to an external organization with a funding request, you're very welcome to contact my team. We can show example grants. We can make suggestions on your budget items, costing suggestions, that sort of thing. So if you've got some funding for a green status assessment, you still have to find time to do it. And so here is my advice on expediting green status of species assessments. One great thing that's been really successful for specialist groups in the past has been to add on a bit of green status assessment to a red listing workshop that you already have planned, or a conference that a lot of your specialist group members are going to be at. Just add on, a day, a half day to do some green status assessment. It's also very effective in many cases to have an intern or a graduate student draft assessments. So I'm going to share an example from a group that I've been working closely with, which is the cat specialist group of the Species Survival Commission. And their goal, which they set out just last year, is to assess all 40 species. And then they also used the sort of student intern route as well. So actually a student working with me, Elliot Carlton, has just submitted his master's thesis at the University of Oxford. And part of his thesis was doing preliminary assessments of 20 canid species and 20 felid species. And so the cat specialist group and the canid specialist group are using that information to take those drafts to their specialist group, tweak them and refine them a little bit. But it's always easier to work from a draft than to try and do something from scratch. And so having a student who is dedicated to doing that, and they also got a master's thesis out of it, was really a win-win for both groups. So I encourage you to be creative about the ways that you can get assessments drafted. And then finally, of course, from our team, within the Green Status of Species Working Group and our members at the Red List Unit, we are here to support assessment as well. So we can offer advice as you're going through the assessment process, no matter what stage you're in. We can have meetings, online meetings, we can discuss over email. We can also offer bespoke training sessions for your group or an organization. So those can be either online or in person, funding dependent. We can also offer workshops and assessment facilitation. So if you want us to take your group through the assessment process or help out at an assessment workshop, we can do that. And we'll also be able to provide support for SIS when that is launched. And to learn more about that, you know what I'm going to say, come to webinar 3 next week. So with that, I just wanted to put up the contact information for people that you can get in touch with to help with assessment. So a wonderful person to talk to is Magda, who gave the webinar last week introducing the green status of species. She's based at the Red List Unit, and she works full-time on the green status of species. So if you have general queries about assessments or training, she is a great person to get in contact with. You're also very welcome to get in touch with me. I'm the co-chair of the Green Status Working Group. So if you have questions about strategic planning, perhaps you might be wondering which species in your very speciose group would it be best to do green status assessments for. If you have questions about funding opportunities, I'm very happy to help with that as well. So I'll leave this contact information up for a bit, but I will now open it up for questions. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Molly. That was a lot of information, as you said. Really, really useful, though. I personally now really want to get started and look at all of these resources and play around with them. So that's really exciting. Remember to put any questions you have for Molly in the Q&A box in the Zoom, and we'll be reading them out. To start us off while we're waiting for questions to come in, excuse me again, what would you kind of recommend to folks who are starting out doing green status assessments? What are the kind of species that might lend themselves to green status assessments more than others?
That's a fantastic question. So I would say, one of the main reasons that the green status was developed. So it was the idea first came about in 2012. It's been under development for a long time with lots of input from conservation and scientists around the world. And the idea was that it's meant to complement the red list. It's meant to provide a more complete conservation story and incentivize more ambitious conservation than just not in danger of going extinct as our end goal. And so least concerned species are potentially really interesting to do a green status assessment for, because while they might not be at risk of extinction, they might be considerably depleted. And that's an interesting story to be able to tell. And from an ecological perspective, it's a very interesting story to tell. Conversely, you might also want to look at some of your most threatened species. One of the sort of complaints is a strong word, but grumblings you hear about the red list is that you can have species that are critically endangered for decades. And people can look at that and say, well, why isn't conservation doing anything? Why isn't the species improving? But actually, if you can keep a species from going extinct, that is a huge conservation success. And so the conservation impact metrics of the green status really highlight those hidden conservation successes and bring them to light and tell a more optimistic story if there is one to tell. So those are my recommendations. Magda, do you have anything to add?
No, I think what you said is really good and really true. If people are looking to do green status assessments that are maybe, for their first try, that are slightly simpler ones that they might be able to do a bit quicker. Things like island endemics tend to be a little bit quicker, a little bit easier. But I think what Molly said is definitely true about species for which green status assessments are most valuable.
We
Awesome.
have
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Sorry. We have a question for Molly or Magdalena in our Q&A. So you mentioned finding students to assist with the green status assessments. Do you have any recommendations on how to best find students to assist? And will you recommend undergraduate or graduate students?
Yeah, really good question. So I'm speaking from a privileged place because at my university we have master's students looking for projects every year. So it's pretty easy to find interested students who have a conservation interest. But I would say if you are a specialist group, asking members in your group if any of them are affiliated with the university, if there are student internship or graduate opportunities, and often you can advertise a particular project and see if any students are interested. If it's for graduate work, so a master's project or even an undergraduate thesis, that can be nice because you don't necessarily have to have funding to pay the student, but they are still benefiting from that work. It's really important, obviously, that we're not just, having unpaid interns all the time, but if there's that mutual exchange, it can be really great. Undergraduate versus graduate students, I've worked with both, and it's been successful. So I'd say any student you can get is good. Undergraduate students might need a little bit more guidance, potentially. They might not be as familiar with using the literature, which you would need to do some of these preliminary assessments. But I really can't overstate the value of having a rough draft to be able to present to species experts, rather than them having to find all the information themselves. It's easy to look at a draft and say, oh, actually, I agree or I disagree. Doing the assessment from scratch is what takes a lot of work. So students and interns can be great in facilitating that.
Thank you, Molly.
Fabulous. Do we have any other questions for Molly and Magda? Don't be shy. In the meantime,
everyone just overwhelmed by the information?
I mean, there was a lot of information presented, so that's really great. And I mean, if there are very few questions, generally, I always interpret this as it having been a very thorough and very clear presentation. What would be your 3 kind of take-home messages for any person who wants to do a green status assessment but might feel a little bit overwhelmed? Just like really snappy pep talk for anybody who might feel a little bit overwhelmed right now, like I might be.
So my pep talk is, this framework was designed over about a decade now to be user-friendly. So where we are now versus where we are 10 years ago, we've worked with literally hundreds of species experts around the world, workshopped, tested the framework. So while it's definitely complex, it's doable. And we published a paper a couple years ago where we presented the results of 181 preliminary assessments across taxa, animals, plants, fungi, to show that it can be done for all of these different species, and representation globally as well, marine, freshwater, terrestrial. So it's definitely possible. It is doable. The second take home would be, we are always, my team is available to help. So our working group, and especially Magda and myself, and I think Becca Young, who's on the call, has also been a huge support in working with specialist groups to get assessments done. We're very happy to answer questions, hop on calls, walk you through the information. For a third point, I might turn over to Magda, not to put you on the spot, but you probably have thought of something that I haven't.
Yeah, to be honest, I just wanted to emphasize what you said about us being available to offer support. Like, I think you had a slide sort of that listed the different ways in which we can offer support, but I really do want to emphasize that that is my full-time job, to support assessors in doing these assessments. And there's been many instances where assessors have tried to tackle the assessment on their own and maybe been a little bit overwhelmed. And then they've had a discussion with me, we've arranged a meeting, and then we've created a draft of the assessment together within like 2 hours or something. They won't all be that quick, but I think it's just really important to make the point that it can be a lot easier, a lot quicker, and I can sort of teach you how it's done in a meeting, so that you'll be better equipped to do another assessment if you choose to in the future. So yeah, just don't feel shy. I really want to help you guys do assessments. So yeah, please reach out. We can facilitate assessments, we can train you, all these things, and other assessors have found that to be really useful.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Magda. There was another question in the chat about making all of the various references, links, and so on available in the YouTube video description, and we'll work on that to make sure that all of the information is there. We've got a hand raised. So Anna Loy seems to have a query, and I'm going to allow her to talk. Anna, can you speak?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Awesome.
Hi, I'm Anna Loy. I'm the co-chair of the Author Specialist Group. we did try to assess the green status of some species, but I'm wondering and I'm asking whether this process, the progress on green status, should be in some way, I mean, the co-chair should be informed on what is going on, because I was interacting with Magda, and I discovered that some of the assessors already have provided some assessment for some species I was not aware of. So I'm just asking how and if we as co-chair we should follow the progress, or it's is in charge to the task force for the green status, or even help.
Hi, Anna. Nice to hear from you. So yes, absolutely. I think we've gone through a bit of a growing pains, I suppose, as the assessment is still rather new. We have now established a workflow where when we get a request to start an assessment, we contact the specialist group and or the Red List Authority for that species. Because obviously we want the specialist groups and the Red List authorities to be informed of what's going on. Back when we were still testing the framework, it was a bit of the Wild West, really. But now that we're starting to publish more seriously, have SIS up and running, we have established that workflow. So apologies for that. But going forward, our protocol is to let specialist groups, Red List authorities know whenever we get an expression of interest to assess particular species, and to make sure that the specialist group can be as involved as it wants to be and has some oversight over that assessment. So very good question. Thank you.
Thank you.
We've got another question from Gonzalo Rosa in the Q&A. First of all, he says, thank you very much for walking us through this process. As you mentioned, these assessments are highly time-consuming, with people often not paid to do so. We, and then in brackets, research conservation communities, are still struggling with red listing, with loads of species yet to be assessed, and do it every 10 years. Wouldn't save time, effort, and money to just have a single assessment where all that information is provided?
So kind of combining the red and green, I think is what you're getting at. So the green status it's a new optional part of the Red List assessment. So if you feel that it's valuable for your species to have that information about recovery status and conservation impact, it is technically part of the Red List assessment. So it's not required for species at this time, but if you think that information helps tell a more complete conservation story, that's what it's there for. And, as we were designing the green status of species, we did a lot of stakeholder engagement. And one of the things that the concerns that we definitely heard was the time limits on conservation scientists and researchers. How do you keep up with Red List and, these new green status metrics of the Red List? One thing that I will say is that because the green status is shiny and new at the moment, and it does tell these interesting things, it can be a mechanism to get funding to do Red List assessments in general. So if you say, we're going to reassess the Red List category of these species and show these new metrics of conservation impact and recovery, that can actually be a new and exciting angle to apply for funding, rather than just doing Red List reassessments, which can be quite difficult to get funding for in some cases. So we're hoping that it will help overall. But again, these are optional assessments. You should do them if you feel that it helps tell the conservation story of the species.
We have an additional question for Molly or Magdalena. How much more information does a green status assessment require over a Red List assessment?
Can I pass that to you, Magda? You're in the thick of it every day.
Yeah, sure. So that vastly depends on your species, to be honest. So as Molly mentioned, and as I discussed in my seminar last week, you divide your species range into spatial units. to determine the green score. And species that have more spatial units require a lot more information than species that have fewer spatial units. So that's kind of why I mentioned earlier that island endemics tend to be a little bit quicker, because often they have very few spatial units, sometimes even just one. So fewer information is required. But if you have a species with 20 spatial units, the maximum number, of course, you then need to gather data for each of 20 spatial units and determine the state for each of 20 spatial units. So yeah, the answer is that it's vastly dependent. Of course, you also, in a green status assessment, require information about indigenous range and ideally also information about the species functionality. So I guess that is most of the additional information you need. But again, I just want to stress, if you're struggling, if you're finding it difficult or too big a task, then do contact us and we'll help you, we'll support you in finding the information and putting all the information together in the assessment. And we can help you streamline that process and make it a lot quicker. So yeah, I hope that answers that question.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Magdalena.
Magda. I'll just add something to that, which is that in our next webinar, stay tuned for webinar 3, we'll be talking a bit about uncertainty. And as a bit of a sneak peek, it is possible to do an assessment if you don't have perfect historical information, or you have information about some spatial units, but less information about others. You can still do a valid assessment, but reflect that uncertainty in the assessment. So that will be covered in more detail next week, but just to say, you don't need to know absolutely everything that's ever happened to the species to do a green status assessment.
I think that's all. No more questions for now. Moni, any additional comments? She's mute.
Sorry, I had temporarily lost the ability to unmute myself. It's probably my voice telling me to just be quiet and rest it a little bit. No, there are no more questions, which is great. That brings us directly up to the hour on this webinar. Thank you again, Molly and Magda, for all the work that you put into this webinar series. I think it was an amazing amount of information, and hopefully it's shown folks that it is indeed doable to do these green status assessments, and that a lot of support is available. You heard a lot about the famous webinar 3. I'll put in the chat the link where you can find the registration link in case you haven't already registered for webinar 3, which will be next Monday. And it will be great to see a lot of you there again. So thank you very much, Molly and Magda, and thank you very much all for listening in today. Thank you.